the way that we ought to read them is to say, oh, that's different. Why did he say it that way? Remember, these are theological works as much as they are biographical. They're meant to tell you something about who Jesus is, not simply tell you about Jesus. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Whiskey and the Writings. I'm your host, Joe, and today we're talking about the Synoptic Gospels, and we're going to learn some things that they probably didn't tell you in church. I'm so glad you're here. Today I'm finishing off a bottle of Yellowstone. This is a 93 proof Kentucky Straight Bourbon, just a delicious sipping bourbon. We're at the end of it. I've already poured here in my whiskey glass, but this is such a simple bourbon to sip on. It's got a lot of caramel notes to it. You can really, the smell, the tastes, a little bit of a burn, not too crazy though, only being 93%. But that's what I'm drinking. Whatever you have in front of you, cheers and drink responsibly. And let's get into it. Okay. I'm going to try to make this video a little bit quicker than some of my other videos. I don't know how successful I'm going to be to that end, but my hope is that I want to try to be a little bit more clear, concise, help you get through these videos. I know sometimes I can ramble and go long, but for today we're going to try. We're going to try to be a little bit more efficient with our time. So again, thank you so much for watching. Those of you that have subscribed, thank you so much. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to do so. But we're going to be talking about the Synoptic Gospels, and I'm going to be looking at some things. I'll probably be bringing up some observations that might be new to you, you've never heard before. If you've attended church any period of time, you usually don't get this kind of background information about these. A lot of people don't talk about the things that we're going to talk about in churches, and some people just don't even know that these are things that scholars look at when they take a look at these texts that we call the Synoptics. So what are the Synoptics? That's just the technical term to label the first three Gospels that we have in our New Testament, these biographies, ancient theological biographies of Jesus's life, his birth, life, death, and resurrection. And the first three of that four-set volume that we have is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And those are called synoptics. They're classified as synoptics. And the reason being is because they share a similar thread. And we're going to talk about that, where there is a difference in John. John's gospel is not a part of this threefold set of writings that we have about Jesus's life, because John's gospel is so unique. It stands outside of the thread and themes, by and large, that those first three biographies have. The first three biographies share a similar narrative, a similar timeline, whereas John, he just does something entirely different. The reality is that when you're looking at John's gospel, you're looking at something that is unique and fresh, in that roughly 90% of the content in John's gospel, the stories, the sayings, are unique to that gospel, meaning you don't find those stories or sayings in the Synoptics, the first three. So it stands apart as something different. And yes, one of our viewers, Blind Critic, I will be doing a video on John, just like you asked in one of the comments. Thank you. So I will be following up on a video soon on John's, and maybe it'll be the next one, because we're talking about the Synoptics. I've already talked about Mark. Maybe I'll do one on Matthew, Luke, and then I'll finish off with John. How about that? Okay, so the Synoptics, it's just a way to classify these first three writings, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So why do they do that? Why is there this classification? Why don't they stand on their own? Why don't they present different information like John does? Why are they so similar to each other? In the past, people have tried to harmonize these three. They've tried to make them work together, and and you can be pretty successful doing that. If you wanted to take the narrative of Jesus, the biography of Jesus, and turn it into a singular volume, you can get closer to doing it. I don't think you can be successful. I think you can get closer with the Synoptics because they share a similar trajectory in how they tell the story. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why is because so the way that scholars think about this, and to say that this is universal is too broad of a statement. Consensus in scholarship is few and far between, but you can get trajectories in scholarship, meaning that most think this way or maybe have a similar idea or thought. But I say all that to say that when the examination of these Gospels take place, one thing that we notice is that Mark, being the shortest of them, has a framework in it that Matthew and Luke seem to borrow. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to create an outline off of the events, sayings, life, deed, actions of Jesus, the way that Mark lays them out in his gospel, you can take that as a foundation, as a framework, as a blueprint, I guess. Blueprint's probably the better word. You can use that blueprint, and that blueprint actually maps onto what Matthew does and what Luke does. So what does that mean? It seems that when Matthew and Luke were constructing their biographies, they most likely had Mark's gospel that they built their framework off of. Now, that's the hypothesis, is that Mark serves as the baseline for the other two gospels. It might work out something like this. It's wrong to think that these authors, and I use the word authors without using their names, and we'll get into that in a second, but these authors that composed Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not together when they wrote them. They were at different places, and they were writing at different times. Okay, so the hypothesis is that Mark constructs his gospel, and I talk a little bit about why I think it actually is Mark. I think it's likely. I think it's the tradition that supports and shares that information, although it can be dated late for sure. I think is still the most credible. Can we know for sure that it was Mark, Peter's interpreter? Do we know that Papias was accurate in retelling that? That's speculation. For me, I just go, there's no reason to not believe it. Okay, so if that tradition dates to Papias, who is writing at the turn of the century, who most likely, at least tradition has it, that he was a disciple of John, I just don't see any credible reason why that shouldn't be the case. So I just go with Mark wrote his gospel, Mark, and he wrote it according to Papias through the stories that Peter had passed on, and so it's through the lens of Peter. For more on that, go check out the last week's video on Mark. But I say that to say it seems to be that Mark's gospel might have been the first one written down in a narrative format. Okay. We'll get into the bag. I said this was going to be short, and I don't think I'll get there. But bear with me. So Mark's composition comes very early. That's the prevailing thought is that Mark's gospel is the first narrative written down, and then it's circulated. Right, it's copied, it's passed around. Papias also mentions in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History of the Church that it was likely composed in Rome, which makes sense with the later tradition of those who share that story being in Rome, having Mark's gospel. So the idea is that is composed and it is circulated and passed around. And then the idea is that at the time that Matthew, or at the time of Luke, and maybe you can exchange who's came first or second or third in their arrangement. We don't know, but they seem to be dated later because they share the framework of Mark, which makes one think that Matthew and Luke had copies of Mark, a copy of Mark, by which they use that as the framework, and then they filled in different details. So here's how this works. It gets interesting because you have the same story that Mark says in Luke or in Matthew, and then Matthew and Luke will add details to it that aren't found in Mark. Okay, so Mark is the blueprint, and then they fill in details around it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, okay? So this is in scholarship, this is called like the Matthew tradition, the Luke tradition, the Mark tradition, these stories that they're sharing about Jesus' life. So here we go. This is where it gets really interesting. So Mark is the blueprint, right? And they have Mark, and Matthew's filling in details around the stories that Mark builds out. And then you have Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, which are composed at different places at different times, that are actually sharing the same story that's not found in Mark. Okay. Now, you settle in this, that they're not sitting down in a room together and going like, oh, what are you going to say? Oh, okay, I'll say this and I'll do this, right? That's a fallacy, a way of thinking that's just untrue. Okay. The likelihood is that when Matthew is composing his gospel and Luke is composing his gospel, they were unaware of each other's gospels. Okay, they could be. That's a hypothesis, right? We don't know for sure. But the hypothesis that I think is pretty credible and worth investigating is that these two independent writers, Matthew and Luke, not knowing that they're, it's not like Luke's going, hey, Matthew, what are you doing? And like, oh, I'm going to say this. That's not how it works. They're doing their own thing, but they're sharing the same story in the same way, but Mark doesn't have it. So what does that mean? It seems that as they're independently writing their version, they have a source that Mark didn't use. They have something at their disposal that has been circulated that they share that same tradition. So where this comes in scholarship is they call this Quelle, which means source. It's a German word that means source, and it's a made-up thing, okay? So we don't have Quelle. We don't have this source. The shorthand for it in scholarship conversation is called Q. This Q document, this source document that it appears that Matthew had it and Luke had it, but Mark maybe was unaware of it or had it and didn't choose to use it, whatever the reason. But Matthew and Luke did. They had this source. And the idea here, again, it's all made up. We don't actually know, but it's compelling because it's trying to answer for the question of how did Matthew and Luke share the exact same story if they had not, had this document in front of them. They're writing decades later after the life events. And so one might go, well, they knew Jesus, right? Matthew knew Jesus. Okay, let's just start with the assumption that the writer of Matthew, which is not known, we don't know, the writer doesn't identify themselves in the gospel, but let's assume that the tradition that holds is that it's Matthew, the disciple. Let's assume that that's true for a second. Luke was not a disciple, okay? Luke didn't follow Jesus around on the earth, right? So you have Mark and Luke who were not eyewitnesses. Papias in his saying, talking about Mark's gospel, said that flat out said that Mark wasn't an eyewitness. He didn't follow around Jesus, but he listened to the tradition that Peter passed down. Okay, so Luke is the same. Luke's not a follower of Jesus. So the concept, the idea to say that like, well, what they just knew because they were there. Maybe we can say Matthew was there. Let's just be generous and say that Matthew was there. and that he penned this. Luke wasn't, right? So Luke is still relying on some other source to get his information. And Luke straight up tells us that he interviews eyewitnesses, and so he's getting firsthand information. But what's compelling to think about is this idea of a source, this quella, this Q that existed that helps fill in the gap. Now, what is this Q? The conversation around it, again, all hypothetical, right? Because we don't actually have this source. It's an assumption that there is a source. But that source might have been just sayings of Jesus, much like what you get in the Gospel of Thomas, which is just a bunch of sayings of Jesus. It's not an actual narrative like we think of in the Gospel. So maybe there was like this tradition of sayings of Jesus that got passed around very, very early on, and that became a resource to those who were composing their Gospels. And so these synoptics, they share this similar thread, and they seem to have information that they're borrowing from each other or another document itself. I think this is a compelling thought because Luke outright identifies this. If you read the prologue to Luke's gospel, he just straight up says it. He says, many have attempted to write an account of the life of Jesus. And then he goes, and so I'm going to do it too. And so there's no hiddenness to it. It's fascinating to think about that there are these other documents. Can you imagine one day some kind of archaeological dig in Galilee, or Egypt, and there is, this document that's been preserved that is essentially just sayings of Jesus that could be this source that map onto the helping make sense of these compositions of these gospels. So it's very interesting how these things came to be. So the idea is that Mark, blueprint, then comes later, either Matthew or Luke. It's debatable on when those were composed, but they were borrowing Mark as an outline, and then they filled in their own gaps, their own traditions and thoughts, but then they had another source that Matthew and Luke use that Mark doesn't. And where they got that information, right? That's the debate. So that's interesting. These synoptics, these first three gospels, were really widely circulated. John's gospel comes much later in the tradition. Whether that's the end of the first century or much later. There's some debate about that. Who actually wrote it? Debate about that. That's one thing you'll know on any kind of scholarship conversation. There's discussion. There's debate, and just kind of a sidebar on that. That to me is refreshing. I know a lot of people, they long for certainty. They long for, well, I just got to know. And if I don't know, then it's going to cause all this turmoil inside of myself because I just don't know. And for me, I just think certainty is a product of like the Western way of thinking, that's just foreign to an Eastern thinker. So we need just to be okay with the reality that when I say authors instead of like Matthew and Luke, we're just not as sure as sometimes we want to think we are. I think Mark, again, you can make a good case that it was Mark. I think Luke, you can make a good case for Luke. I think Matthew and John are a little bit more debatable. Was there a group of people that, Matthew's gospel is very Jewish centered, very Jewish centric. You get a lot of like thematic kind of overlays of like Moses and exile, and these kind of greater themes happen in Matthew. Matthew's this kind of like work of art, really, the way it's composed, and so there's some conversation as to like, well, could a first century Judean fisherman, or tax collector, could they have composed something that masterful? It's a beautiful piece of literature, and the way it's composed and the themes that it brings out. Mark is like rough around the corners, right? It's kind of just right out of the gate. You've got action. You've got Jesus doing crazy things. Just hits the ground running. Matthew is a build up. Luke is more structured, more historical, more like Luke is like trying. You clearly see in Luke's gospel he's trying to convince you of something. Luke does unique things that we'll talk about in another video, and how he prominently features women more than Matthew or Mark. The way that Luke tells the stories, it's very structured. I almost like Luke is like an engineer. He kind of has this structured way of presenting the information. I can share that in another video, but these synoptics, they work in amazing ways that you can see their similarities, and then they branch off into their differences. But at the core of these memoirs of the apostles is how they're often talked about in the early centuries of Christianity. These memoirs, these rememberings of the life of Jesus, they serve as this baseline for all that becomes of our faith of Christianity. It's interesting. I find that there are a lot of Christians that like to spend a lot of time in Paul's letters, and rightfully so. Paul's doing some amazing things in helping churches wrestle with what it means to be a Christian. What Paul's not doing is doing a lot of talking about like Jesus, in the sense of like Paul doesn't talk about in his letters the life of Jesus, doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus. He doesn't talk about really the actions of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus. Like Paul is writing as if you already know the stories of Jesus. And Jesus should be the lens by which you read Paul. And so I've said this before: if you're reading Paul and you're wondering where Jesus is in that, like you're reading Paul and you're going, well, that doesn't really look like Jesus. The question I think you should wrestle with is are you reading Paul correctly? Not, is Paul doing something different? I think the challenge for us in our modern day isn't to go, well, Paul's doing something different than Jesus. I think the challenge is that I think Paul has been thoroughly immersed in Jesus. I've shared in videos past about how Paul spent 3 years in the Arabian desert, and what happened in those times we don't really know. It's not talked about, but I think my hypothesis of that is that he was with Jesus. He was learning from Jesus. That explains why he's able to come back to Jerusalem, present himself to the disciples, to the apostles, and then they're like, yeah, you're in. You're one of us. Come on in. Like, how are they so quickly accepting him in? Had he not had such an experience that he could explain Jesus in ways that only they at that time could have, because they experienced him firsthand. So all that to say, I think when we read Paul, we have to be generous to say that if it doesn't look like Jesus, that's us not understanding Paul. It's not Paul doing something different than Jesus. It's that we don't understand what he's saying in relation to what that means through the influence, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so back to synoptics. So the synoptics are composed late. Mark being the earliest, then maybe Matthew, Luke, sometime around there. Then you've got John at the back end. But these three writings are amazing pieces of literature that we need to immerse ourselves into. How is it that, when you're looking at Mark, you're looking through the lens of Peter? How is it through Matthew, you're understanding this cultural connection to what God has been doing historically through the people of Israel, and how Jesus is a fulfillment of that, messianic hope? And how does Matthew layer those things in? You've got Luke, who is systematically kind of working you through who Jesus is and why you ought to believe it. I mean, in Luke's prologue, he outright tells you that he's writing this so Theophilus can have confidence in the things that he was taught. So we just know that Luke's trying to convince you of something. He's trying to convince you that Jesus is Lord. He is King. Matthew's, I believe, trying to convince you that he is the Israel's Messiah, promised Messiah. I think Mark is trying to get you to see the ways in which following Jesus as someone who wants to follow Jesus can oftentimes be difficult and amazing, and it's always a choice. So thematically, an overview like Matthew, again, how is Jesus the Messiah, Israel's promised hope? Luke, how is Jesus King? How is he transforming the world? Mark, in a writing of discipleship, trying to get you to wrestle with the decision making of will I follow him? Will I trust him? All of these working together in this beautiful, amazing way to be these vignettes of the life of Jesus. They're all different. They're all doing different things. That's why I said, earlier, I think it's trying to harmonize these things actually you'll actually lose the voice of the author if you try to harmonize it. We need to let these things breathe and speak for themselves. Matthew's doing something different than Mark's doing something different than Luke's doing, and yet they're all doing one thing, in that they're presenting Jesus, this figure that lived centuries ago, died, resurrected, and transformed the world, left a dent in history. Can you imagine, just for a second, if all we had were Paul's letters, right? The tradition of Christianity just went as Acts kind of tells us, right? People start talking, but we actually didn't have any narrative. It just sat as oral tradition, or these things got lost, or no one thought to sit down and preserve them, right? How different our faith might look today. It's an incredible thing that these narratives have been preserved and shared, and when we sit down and read these things, we're sometimes we're so wooden when we read the text, in that we're just looking for our pull quotes, the devotional for our day, right? What's the thing that's going to make me feel good, or trust the situation I'm in is going to be okay, or whatever we do with these sayings of Jesus, instead of letting them breathe and be their own entity. It's as much as they are similar in their construction, they are different in their voice. And we should let that voice speak for itself. So here's how I'll land this thought. Hopefully this is a shorter video. I should have like a timer somewhere where I could see how long I've been talking. But this is just me just kind of ranting about a subject I love a lot, the Synoptics. And how I want to land it is this. I want to encourage you to pick up these Gospels again. And this time, a lot of times I try to focus just on that one gospel, or maybe you picked up Mark this past week from my last video and decided to reread it again. I encourage you to look at these stories. Start with Mark and look at how the synoptics work off of each other. So find a story about Jesus that is told in Mark, in Matthew, and in Luke. Read those stories in all three of those synoptics, and then write down observations that you're seeing about how they're actually different. What is their arrangement? How is Jesus speaking? Who's he around? Look at the differences, and then ask yourself the question, what might the author want to tell me which caused them to write it in the way that they did, right? They took this framework of Mark, but they wrote it differently. Why? And try to sit with that a little bit. Look at your footnotes, the commentaries at the bottom. If you have an observation, ask me in a comment. We can dialogue about it. But maybe my encouragement is you look at these synoptics, find their similarities, and look for how they're different. And then ask yourself the question, why, right? Be curious, wonder about it. What's Matthew doing? It's not that they're lying, right? Which is how some people treat it. Like, see how Matthew said it different? That's not how Mark did it. They're contradicting each other. So now we can't have any trustworthiness of what Jesus said or did. And that's just untrue. We have to be generous to the author's voice, which is to say that I think the question isn't, did Jesus go to the temple? He most certainly did. So, okay, I'm using an example like when Jesus goes to the temple and turns over the tables. That's an act that happens at the back end of the ministries of Jesus in the Synoptics, but it happens at the beginning of Jesus's ministry in John's gospel. So there's like this difference, right? And then even how those stories are told in the Synoptics are a little bit different. We shouldn't look at that and just say, well, someone's lying, right? As if we have some video cam footage and we know the truth and someone else said it differently, so they're lying. The way that we ought to read them is to say, oh, that's different. Why did he say it that way? Remember, these are theological works as much as they are biographical. They're meant to tell you something about who Jesus is, not simply tell you about Jesus. And so when you notice differences, it's not about who's lying or is there a contradiction. The differences ought to make a flag go up, which they do, right? Because we go, oh, there's something wrong here. No, don't approach it as if something's wrong. Approach it as if, oh, what's the key idea that this writer's trying to get me to think about? Yeah. So maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's not. The Synoptic Gospels are just, they're the bedrock of Christianity and what we believe and how we think of the life, the ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We need to spend more time in them. And my encouragement is for you to do your own deep dive. And if you have questions, thoughts, ideas, concerns about any of it, leave comments. I'd love to chat with you more about it and respond to comments if they're generous. I don't always respond to mean comments, but if you have a genuine question, I'd love to dialogue with you about it. Or if you have a question you want me to cover in a future video, don't hesitate to ask me there as well. And maybe I will feature your question in another upcoming video.